My youngest moves to college this month. And that transition will take our family to the state of Alabama. It is a state that we have never visited. It is a state in which we know no one. It is a state that is entirely unfamiliar to us. And yet, she is certain that this is the college for her. There have been many discussions in our family in recent months about the college that she would attend. We discussed finances, location, and studies. And in the midst of all that discussion, we found ourselves asking a question. What is God's will? What is God's will? Believing that maybe God's will was that she would attend a school in Alabama or Arizona or Arkansas. What is God's will? Perhaps you've asked that question, not as it relates to a school, but to a diagnosis. Because you have someone in your life that has been diagnosed with cancer and battling for some time. They have gone through all types of different treatments. They have seen the cancer into remission, only to have it return. And you continue to pray for their survival. But as you do, you can't help but ask, what is God's will? Believing that His will is that they survive the cancer, or they succumb to its effect. Or perhaps you ask that question relative to a relationship. Because you have a daughter of your own, or even a granddaughter, who has been seeing somebody for some time and believes that this is the person she is going to marry. She's indicated that they are ready to get engaged. And you're not entirely certain about that. Of all the people your daughter or granddaughter has dated, you're not sure that this is the one. There are others that you prefer, or maybe you don't believe that she has met the one that is best for her. And you have conversations with her about relationships and marriage and the meaning of all of these things. And you discuss with her the will of God. To find a particular person, perhaps to marry the one that He has intended. You desire her to ask the question, what is God's will? We may not ask that question as often as we think, because we assume we have the answer. We assume a sense of God's will in our life. That it is His will that my daughter would go to a particular school, or that your friend would recover from the cancer, or that your daughter would marry a certain person. We assume that we may have a sense of God's will. And we're not alone in that assumption. That's something about which we read in the Bible. Not just through our reading today, but our reading throughout the last few weeks. You have been hearing messages in recent weeks from this same chapter in John. And it seems like each of them is a little different. The feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, the bread of life. But the reality is that they comprise a continuous story. The story of Jesus teaching the people, sharing with them insights about His work and role. Having spent the better part of a day with Him, they are removed from towns and villages and desirous of food. The disciples want Jesus to dismiss the crowds to find their own food. But He invites the disciples to feed. They respond that there are only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus blesses them and miraculously feeds more than 5,000 people. The people are enamored of that experience. These are people just like us that work hard for food. And Jesus just gave it to them. They want to be with him. They want to get a better sense of that. And it's not just that he gave them food, he healed their diseases. And they definitely don't want him to go anywhere, but Jesus and the disciples are somewhat tired. And he says to the disciples, let's get out of here and head to the other side of the sea. And he puts them in a boat to do just that as he retreats to pray. And during the night, as they are trying to make their way across the sea, Jesus walks on the water. The disciples notice him, believing that it is a ghost. They are stunned that he is doing that. And yet they marvel at his ability to do all things. They make their way to the other side of the sea, and the next day, the people who he fed question where he is. Because there was only one boat, and they saw the disciples leave, and the next day Jesus wasn't there. Some other boats had arrived, and so they got in those boats and went to the other side of the sea, and they found Jesus there. They said, Jesus, what are you doing here? We saw the one boat leave, and you're over here. And Jesus responded to them by declaring, the reason that you are searching for me is because I gave you food. And because I healed your diseases. The reason that you're searching for me is because you assume you understand the will of God. You believe that the will of God is that I would feed you some more, or that I would heal other diseases. That's the reason you're here. And if I don't keep feeding you, and if I don't heal your diseases, perhaps you won't believe that I'm from God. And Jesus goes on to teach them about the will of God. And he declares to them that he has come to do God's will. But it's not so much the feeding and the healing. God's will is that Jesus would lose none of those that God has given. That is the verse that we shared today. John chapter 6, verses 38-39. Jesus declares that he has come to do the will of God, and the will of God is that he would lose none that God has given him, but raise them up on the last day. And then he goes on to say that the will of God in your life is that you would believe on the one that he has sent, and he will raise you up on the last day. So Jesus declares to them that the will of God is not the feeding and the healing. The will of God is the raising. And they may not be sure what to make of that. And perhaps we aren't either. What if I were to say to you that the will of God is not that your daughter marries this guy or that guy? The will of God is not that your friend recovers or succumbs to the cancer. And the will of God is not that my daughter attends a school in Alabama or Arkansas or Arizona. The will of God is something entirely different. It matters that we understand this. Because every time we gather, we pray, your will be done. And so we really want to have a sense of that prayer and its meaning. Perhaps this example may help. I get to serve churches and ministries all over the southwestern United States. I travel in Arizona, California, and Nevada. But the headquarters for our church in this part of the country is located in Irvine, California. And at some point this week, my will is going to be to travel to Irvine. And if that were my will to travel to Irvine from Marana, there are a few different ways that I can do that. I can take more road and cut back down to Tangerine and get out on the 10 and take the 10 all the way up to the 8 and head west on the 8 into San Diego and jump up on the 5 and take the 5 to where it splits with the 405, and then I'm going to be in Irvine, California. Or I could go out more and cut down to Tangerine and get back on the 10 and take the 10 all the way up through Phoenix and cut through the desert, Palm Springs and that whole area out there. And then I could jump on the 60 and I could take the 60 to the 91 and the 91 to the 55 and the 55 to the 5 and get off, and then I am in Irvine, California. Now, with any of those, is my will accomplished? Yeah, because my will is to get to Irvine. My will is not to take the 5 or the 55 or the 91 or the 10. My will is never to take the 10. Those may be the ways that my will is accomplished. And that's the reality of God's will and God's ways. God's will is that we would believe on Jesus and he would raise us up on the last day. Everything else are the ways that he may use to accomplish that. It's not just us who praise that prayer, your will be done. It was Jesus who found himself praying just before he was arrested, as he readied to hang on a cross, and he prayed, Father, if this cup can pass from me. And the translation of that is, if there is another way, if you can take the 5 instead of the 10, the 91 instead of the 55, if there is another way that these people can be saved, but not my will, yours be done. And the response the Father gave Jesus was that that was the only way. There was no other way than him hanging on the cross, paying for what we had done wrong, being put in a tomb, and then rising from the dead so that we would live with him forever. It reveals to us that God will use whatever way to accomplish his will. And so when we find ourselves praying about whether or not our friend is going to recover from cancer, it's not God's will that she succumbs. It may not be God's will that she recovers. It's God's will that her brother Matt, who hasn't darkened the doorstep of a church in 30 years, would come to her funeral, hear the message of Jesus Christ, and believe. That's God's will. And so when we're praying, your will be done, we absolutely want God's will. People believing in Jesus, being raised up on the last day. But we're also praying, God, if you can take another way. You may be on the 5 right now, and my friend may succumb to cancer. But if you can accomplish your will by taking the 10, please do that. And there are moments that God will answer that prayer. And he will respond and take another way because we pray. And there are moments he won't, because that is the best way to accomplish his will. It is an extraordinary teaching that Jesus has for the disciples. And it's one that he will have to teach again and again, not just to them, but to us. And the evidence of that is 3 chapters later. Not just in John 6, but also in John 9. Because Jesus and the disciples are still together, and they encounter a man blind from birth. And the disciples have a question for him. And they ask a question, but it's not really the question that you may think. Because so often when it relates to the will of God, the question that we ask ourselves is why? Why did God permit that? Why did that happen in my life? Why is he allowing that? Why is my daughter going through difficulty with that person that she married? Why did my friend die from cancer? Why is my daughter having a hard time on the other side of the country and at a school that may not be a fit for her? Why? When it comes to the will of God, that was the same question the disciples asked. Because they're in John 9, they're hanging out with Jesus, and they encounter this man blind from birth, and they ask Jesus, who? It sounds like a who question, but it's really a why. They ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now really, their question is, why is he blind? Why him? Something he did, something his parents did? Because the disciples believe, like us, that if we understand the why, then we can understand God's will. Then we'll figure it out. We'll have an understanding of the way God is at work. We can maybe influence it and get a handle on it. And Jesus responds to the disciples there in John 9. It's not that this man or his parents sinned, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And in responding the way he did, Jesus adjusts their question. Jesus reveals to them that the question is not why, the question is what. It's not why did this happen, it's what is God doing? What is God doing to accomplish his will through this? Jesus said this happened so that the work of God may be displayed in his life. And then he went on to do something extraordinary that deepened the man in faith and brought many other people to faith. And that's the same for us. As we question the will of God in our lives, we may get caught up asking the why. And Jesus wants to make that same transition to the what. What is God doing? What is he using to accomplish his will? My youngest daughter is moving to college this month. It's going to be different. My wife and I are going to be without any kids in the house. Just going to be the two of us hanging out. We're going to have kids in different parts of the country, having to parent in a different way. Seems like everything is going to be different. But not the will of God. That's the message that Jesus had for the disciples and for us. The will of God. And he will use anything and everything to accomplish it. Is that we believe on the one that he sent, the one who hung on the cross, and that he will raise us up on the last day. What is God's will? That's a question that he's already answered. In the name and for the sake of Jesus.